The date is April 14th, 2026. Somewhere inside the private legal chambers off Buckingham Palace, a leather folder is placed on a mahogany table. Inside that folder is a single letter written years ago by a woman who is no longer alive. And when the lawyers finish reading it aloud, King Charles III will realize something devastating. He never had the power he thought he had. Not over Bagshot Park, not over the Dukedom of Edinburgh, and not over the tiara his own sister-in-law refuses to hand back. What if I told you that Prince Edward, the quietest son, the one Charles believed he could manage with a phone call and a legal memo, has just walked out of that room with everything intact: the title, the estate, the jewels, and a document signed by the late Queen Elizabeth II that no lawyer in London can override. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what that letter said, why Camilla pushed so hard to bury it, how Princess Anne stepped in at the moment everything was about to collapse, and why insiders are now calling this the single most humiliating legal defeat of Charles's reign. Before we go any further, hit subscribe, because this story pulls back a curtain the palace has spent years holding shut. And once you see what's behind it, you'll understand why the monarchy has never felt this fragile. Let's rewind. To understand what happened in that chamber, you have to understand who Prince Edward really is. Not the Edward the tabloids invented. Not the youngest son shuffled to the side. The real one. The boy who grew up watching his older brothers absorb every camera flash, every headline, every expectation, while he learned something more valuable than attention. He learned to listen. He learned the corridors. He learned which courtier answered to whom. And most importantly, he learned who his mother trusted, because Queen Elizabeth II trusted very few people. But she trusted Edward. For decades, Edward was handed the ceremonial roles no one else wanted. The regional visits, the armed forces liaisons, the charities without cameras. He did them without complaint. He built a marriage to Sophie Rhys-Jones that grew into something the rest of the family quietly envied: steady, warm, unbroken by scandal. They raised their children away from the tabloid glare at Bagshot Park, a 51-acre Georgian estate set deep in the Surrey countryside, held on a 50-year crown lease that Elizabeth herself had signed off on in 1998. That lease is worth something in the region of $30 million in today's market. And that number matters. Stay with that number, because it becomes the whole battle. Then came March 10th, 2023, Edward's 59th birthday. And Charles, in what the palace framed as a gesture of brotherly love, formally bestowed upon him the Dukedom of Edinburgh, the title their father Prince Philip had held for over 70 years. Sophie became the new Duchess of Edinburgh. The photographs were warm, the press coverage was flattering. But here's the thing nobody outside the innermost circle understood at the time. That title wasn't a gift from Charles. It couldn't be, because Queen Elizabeth had already promised it, in writing, and that piece of paper, small, folded, tucked inside a leather binder in the private archives at Windsor, was about to detonate. Now, for the first year after the coronation, things looked calm on the surface. Charles was busy consolidating. He wanted a slimmer monarchy. He wanted tighter control of the crown estate valuations. He wanted, according to sources close to his household, a full audit of every asset carrying a royal designation: properties, paintings, jewelry, leases, warrants, the lot. To Charles, this was modernization. To everyone else in the family, it began to feel like something else entirely. It began to feel like a hostile takeover of his own bloodline. Ask yourself something. What kind of king believes he can rewrite the private arrangements his own mother made in her final years? What kind of monarch looks at a lease his father lived under and decides, quietly, that the terms should be revisited? Because that is exactly what began happening in the spring of 2024. Letters started arriving at Bagshot Park. Polite letters. Formal letters. Letters requesting clarification on tenancy structures. Letters suggesting that certain estates might be more efficiently managed under a centralized model. Sophie, according to those monitoring the family's internal dynamics, read every single one of them before Edward did. And she began keeping copies. Think about that for a moment. A duchess quietly building a file on her own brother-in-law, the king, not out of malice, out of instinct. Because she had seen this pattern before, and she recognized what it was becoming. Then came the tiara. The anthem tiara, sometimes called by other names in older palace inventories, but known within the family by that quieter designation, is not the largest piece in the royal collection. It is not the most photographed. But it is one of the most personal. Elizabeth had loaned it to Sophie for the first time nearly 2 decades earlier, and over the years, that loan had softened into something closer to permanence. Sophie wore it at state banquets. She wore it at anniversary galas. She wore it most memorably on the evening of a Windsor dinner in late 2022, just months before Elizabeth's death. Inside the palace, staff understood what that meant. Elizabeth did not give jewelry lightly. When she wanted a piece to travel with a family member, she said so. And she had said so about the anthem. But Charles, working through a newly appointed royal collections advisor, wanted the tiara catalogued. Then valued. Then, according to 2 separate insiders, reassessed for appropriate custodianship. That phrase, appropriate custodianship, is the kind of language courtiers use when they want to take something back without saying the word take. By the summer of 2025, the letters to Bagshot Park had stopped being polite. They had become legal. And this is where the story turns. Because Edward, the quiet one, the youngest, the boy who had learned the corridors, did something Charles never expected. He hired his own lawyers, not palace lawyers, not the family firm that had handled royal affairs for generations. He hired an outside team based in Lincoln's Inn, specialists in trust law, estate covenants, and the peculiar legal architecture that surrounds crown property. And he handed them one document. Just one. The letter his mother had written. Nobody outside that legal team has seen the full text. But according to sources who have been briefed on its contents, the letter did 3 things, and it did them with the precision of a woman who knew exactly what she was protecting against. First, it confirmed that the Dukedom of Edinburgh was to pass to Edward, in full, upon a moment of her choosing, or shortly after her death, and that this transfer was not conditional on the approval of the reigning monarch. Elizabeth had structured it as a personal covenant, not a crown grant subject to reversal. Second, it confirmed the tenancy of Bagshot Park for Edward and Sophie and their direct descendants under the original lease terms that could not be renegotiated by a subsequent sovereign without breach. And third, in a single paragraph that reportedly made one of Charles's advisors physically stand up from his chair when he read it, the letter designated specific personal effects, including named pieces of jewelry, as gifts, not loans. The anthem tiara was on that list. Not a loan. A gift. Signed, witnessed, dated. If you've made it this far, hit like. Because what happens next is the part the palace has worked hardest to keep out of the papers, and it deserves to be seen by more than the small circle of people who already know. Because when Charles's team received notice that this letter existed, they did what powerful institutions always do when confronted with something they cannot easily dismiss. They stalled. They questioned its authenticity. They requested the original. They suggested forensic examination. They floated, in one memo that has since been described to royal watchers, the possibility that the late Queen's cognitive state at the time of signing might be relevant. Read that sentence again. They suggested questioning their own late monarch's competence to protect her youngest son. And that is the moment Princess Anne walked in. Anne, according to those who know her best, does not raise her voice. She does not need to. She has spent 7 decades watching the machinery of the monarchy grind up people who trusted it, and she has developed a very particular tolerance for what she will and will not permit. When she heard what was being said about her mother, the mother she had ridden with, worked alongside, defended for a lifetime, she requested a private audience with Charles at Clarence House. We don't know the full contents of that meeting. What we do know, from 2 separate sources who were briefed afterward, is that Anne brought with her a single folder. Inside were copies of correspondence between Elizabeth and her private solicitor from the final 18 months of the Queen's life, corroborating the mental clarity, the legal soundness, and the deliberate intent behind every arrangement she had made for her children. Anne reportedly said, "Only a few sentences." But one of them, according to an insider who has repeated it to more than one journalist off the record, was this: She knew exactly what she was doing. And she did it because she knew you would try. Think about that for a moment. She did it because she knew you would try. The mother of the king, from beyond her own grave, had anticipated her son's overreach. She had legally armored her youngest child against her eldest. And Anne, the only sibling with the standing and the spine to say it out loud, had just told Charles to his face that his own mother had seen him coming. The room, according to the story that has now traveled through 3 separate royal households, went completely silent. But here's where it gets even more chilling, because Camilla was not silent. Camilla, queen consort, has spent her entire life understanding one thing better than almost anyone in that palace, that power is not what you hold, it's what you're willing to reach for when others hesitate. And she was not prepared to let this go quietly. Sources monitoring the internal dynamics of the household describe her as the driving force behind the continued legal pressure through the autumn of 2025 and into early 2026. She reportedly viewed the anthem tiara and the precedent it represented as a line that could not be surrendered without weakening every future claim the crown might make on any privately gifted royal object. She was not wrong about that. She was only wrong about who she was fighting. Because Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, is not a woman who flinches. She had spent a quarter of a century inside that family, watching, learning, holding her tongue. She had survived scandals not of her making. She had raised her children in a household deliberately kept small and quiet. And when Camilla's preferred advisor sent a final letter in February of 2026 requesting the return of the tiara for a temporary catalog review, Sophie's response, drafted by her own solicitors and copied to Edward's legal team, was a single paragraph long. It reportedly ended with the line, "The item referenced is not on loan. There is nothing to return." Not a press release, not a public statement. A quiet, short, controlled piece of paper. And it landed like a door closing, which brings us back to that chamber on April 14th, 2026. Picture the room. Long table. Green shaded lamps. 3 lawyers on one side representing the Crown's private legal office. 2 lawyers on the other side representing Edward and Sophie. A courtier standing near the door, hands folded, saying nothing. And on the table, that leather folder. Inside it, the letter. The Crown's lead solicitor asks, one final time, whether Edward would be willing to consider a negotiated framework, a compromise, a face-saving arrangement, a joint statement. Something that would allow Charles to appear generous rather than defeated. Edward, according to a source with direct knowledge of the meeting, looked at the folder for a long moment before he answered. He did not raise his voice. He did not lean forward. He simply said, "My mother already negotiated this. I'm here to honor her, not to renegotiate her." And then he stood up. One sentence. Delivered without heat, delivered without threat. And it ended a legal campaign that had cost the Crown's office, according to one estimate whispered among royal watchers, well over $2 million in fees, memos, forensic assessments, and archival research. Edward walked out of that room with the Dukedom of Edinburgh confirmed and unassailable. He walked out with Bagshot Park's lease intact through 2048 and beyond. He walked out with the anthem tiara legally, permanently, and privately Sophie's. And Charles, according to those close to him, did not appear in public for 3 days afterward. Now zoom out, because this is not really a story about a tiara. It is not really a story about an estate or a title. It is a story about the moment a king realized he had inherited a throne, not a family. That the machinery of the monarchy he was so eager to modernize had been quietly wired, years before his coronation, to protect the people he was most likely to overlook. Elizabeth, in her final years, had done something no British monarch had done so thoroughly in living memory. She had drafted a private legal architecture around each of her children, not equal, not identical, but tailored. Andrew had one. Anne had one. Edward had one. Even Charles himself, though the terms of his have never been made public, is understood to have received his own version. She had, in effect, treated the monarchy the way a wise farmer treats a divided estate. She had fenced it. She had deeded it. She had made sure no one child could swallow another, and the palace that built its entire identity on control was, for the first time in a generation, no longer controlling its own house. The ripple effects are already being felt. Staff who have worked at Buckingham Palace for decades say they have never seen the household so quietly divided. Two of Charles's senior advisors have reportedly stepped back from portfolios involving family assets. Sophie's public appearances have become noticeably more prominent. Her wardrobe choices at recent state events described by observers as unmistakably confident. Edward has begun accepting patronages he had previously declined, moving with the ease of a man who no longer wonders whether the ground beneath him is his own. And Camilla? Camilla, sources say, has grown quieter, not softer, just quieter. The kind of quiet that watches, and waits, and remembers. Because in a family like this, no defeat is ever final. It is only paused. Here is the emotional truth of what happened. A mother, from beyond her own life, reached forward through paper and ink and legal covenant to protect the son the world had underestimated. And that son, without shouting, without spectacle, without a single press briefing, stood in a room full of the most powerful lawyers in Britain and honored her by refusing to let her promises be undone. That is not a story about jewelry. That is a story about love, executed with the precision of a will. And it changes everything about how we understand the next chapter of this reign. Because if Elizabeth built these quiet fortresses around Edward and Anne, what did she build around William? What did she build around the grandchildren she loved most fiercely? What did she build, perhaps most importantly of all, around Harry, the grandson, whose relationship with the crown remains unresolved, whose name still appears in family trusts, and whose own inheritance may yet contain surprises that no one, not even Charles, has fully mapped? There is one more letter. Insiders say it exists. It has not yet been opened. And what happens when it is may make everything you have just heard look like the opening act. If you've made it this far, hit like, because stories like this don't stay buried for long. And the more of us who listen, the harder they are to bury again. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because the next chapter of this reckoning belongs to a grandson the palace has spent years trying to forget, and the paper trail his grandmother left behind may finally force them to remember. The date is April 14th, 2026. The folder is closed. The lawyers are gone, and somewhere inside Bagshot Park, a tiara sits on a velvet cushion in a private drawing room, catching the last of the evening light, exactly where a queen intended it to be.